Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é um narrador, palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Este é o início da mensagem. Comece com energia total e um tom de comando, capturando a atenção imediatamente. I stand on the gravel forecourt, the castle's stone mass behind me catching the low light like a ship's hull. A cold wind pushes across the lawn, and in its wake the clipped yew hedges smell faintly of resin. Beyond them, the glen opens, a blue wash of distant hills and the slow ribbon of the river. The castle here is not a museum frozen in amber. It is lived in wood and stone, a place that breathes with the seasons and the people who have kept it. I can already hear, faint and steady, the memory of bells that have rung across these fields for more than a century. If you love castle tours and heritage stories, stay with me to the end. Subscribe and like if you find yourself drawn to old houses, conservation, and the quiet courage of communities that refuse to let their history burn away. I cross the threshold with my hands in my pockets, adjusting to the warmth and the hush. The entrance hall opens into a long armory hall lined with banners and polished pikes. Light comes through tall sash windows, and the dust motes turn slowly in columns as if paying attention to the tapestries stitched with clan emblems and silver thread. The house smells of beeswax, warmed oak, and a faint trace of smoke, memory, not danger. The Duke meets me at the foot of the main stair. He is taller than I expected, his voice steady, hospitable in that particular way of people who have practiced welcome as ritual. This has been home to my family for generations, he says, gesturing around the room as if the walls themselves are relatives. It keeps its secrets, but it also asks for attention. Behind him, the Duchess moves with the ease of someone who knows exactly where every cushion should be placed. Her laugh is quick and bright. It sounds, oddly, like sunlight on metal. They are candid, not theatrical, stewards of a place that must be both private home and public responsibility. The castle's recorded history is particular. It hosted a royal visit in 1875 when Queen Victoria passed through, and a family marriage in 1871 that bound the house to prominent circles of the time. During the 20th century, it served in the years of war as a training ground. D-Day preparations touched these grounds, and men moved across its lawns rehearsing for an operation that would change everything. The estate also suffered a significant fire on November 5, 1975, an event that, like a shard of glass, refracts many stories of loss and rescue. These are facts that shape the bones of the place, but the living tissue has been stitched back by hands that knew how to mend. We move from the public rooms into the quieter private corridors. The Duke's voice turns lower as he recounts the night of the fire, not in lurid detail, but with the measured regret of someone who remembers damage and the work that followed. We lost some things we will never replace, he says, but what astonished us was the way the town came. The sense of communal action appears again and again in the house's post-fire story. A local ensemble of volunteers, tradesmen, and neighbors who salvaged what they could, wrapped fragile volumes in blankets, pulled charred frames from smoke-blackened niches. That rescue formed the thread that, decades later, still holds many of the restoration decisions together. In the vault below the house, the air cools at once. Allison, the archivist, meets us by the heavy metal door and clicks on a small lamp. She wears sensible shoes and a face that reads eagerness more than fatigue. The archive is a room that smells of paper, linen, and the muted metal tang of climate control. Shelves rise in careful rows. Boxes are labeled with neat, unhurried handwriting. Allison moves like someone who has promised these papers a life of careful attention. We try to keep temperature and humidity steady, she explains. Paper dislikes surprise. It prefers routine. Her voice is practical, but there is a softness when she says it, as if she is describing people as much as objects. She brings out a folder labeled with a year and a hand I recognize from earlier inventories. This is the volunteer registry from 1975, she says. It's full of names, fishermen, bakers, school teachers, people who turned up to help. We've had people adopt documents from this batch. It's a way to keep the story alive and fund conservation. Allison's explanation is the kind of exposition that belongs in the exact middle of a tour, technical enough to satisfy, gentle enough to invite. She talks me through conservation treatments, deacidification baths, mending with Japanese tissue, and capsulation in inert polyester, phrasing the work as a series of small mercies. I press my fingers to a closed volume and feel the cool leather under the cloth. It is a physical contact with continuity. Later, in the kitchen, where the hearth is still used for occasional feasts, the Duchess tells me about choosing what parts of the house to open to the public and what to keep closed. It's a balancing act, she says. They are careful about privacy, but there is also a pragmatic willingness. Heritage, she believes, must pay its way in modest ways. Tours, seasonal events, a small shop selling local crafts. The shop is a delight. Wooden toys carved by a neighbor, jars of jam with labels that list the hedgerow flowers, hand-bound notebooks with reproductions of letters pulled from the collection. It is cottage industry and outreach, and it binds visitors to the castle's continuing livelihood. Outside, Glen, the head gardener, walks me through the formal beds. He moves slowly, stooping to show me buds that promise roses in June. The soil is dark and almost of one temperature. He tells me about winter pruning, about soil pH, about the patience it takes to coax a rose from a bare stick. Gardens are a slow conversation with time, he says, scattering a handful of soil between his fingers like confetti. There is a humble pride in his speech. The seasons are his interlocutors. Tom, the head stalker, takes me along a narrow path onto the estate's higher ground. We climb through bracken and then open onto a sweep of moor where deer feed and the world simplifies into slope, wind, and the measured flurries of gorse. Tom speaks of tradition. Deer stalking is not merely sport here, but an ecological practice connected to herd health and habitat. He tells of early mornings, of the precise music of treading across peat, of how the land demands respect. His stories carry the precise cadence of someone who has understood long stewardship as a moral grammar. Interspersed with these portraits are the archival moments that stitch the emotional logic of the place. Allison shows me a bundle of letters bound with faded twine. One is dated 1871, a cheerful, ink-splattered note from a relative abroad discussing arrangements for Princess Louise's marriage and the ways such alliances shape social networks. Another, later, is a typed page from the 1940s, a list of men stationed on the estate, their names and trunk numbers, notations that a captain had been posted elsewhere. There are photographs, too. Black and white images of soldiers walking the drive, the house with scaffolding, close-ups of faces that look like neighbors. The documents do not merely record a sequence of events, they create a texture of personal life. Allison persuades me to handle a particular letter with gloves. I read the paraphrase aloud because the ink has faded, and she fills in the provenance. Written by an ancestor of the current Duke in 1889, sent to a local bell founder. The letter explains a bequest that would fund the casting of a new bell if the family could secure the right partner.
It was never acted upon, Allison says. Somewhere along the way, the money was diverted for repairs, and the Bell project was shelved. We had hints of the envelope, but not the full letter until the collection was reorganized after the fire. The archive is full of such almosts, things that might have been, projects that were interrupted by events large and small. Here, the fire of November 1975 takes on its place in the sequence. It charred bindings, smudged ink, and forced inventories to be shuffled into temporary storage. But it also compelled the town. The Bell idea, buried in a margin, seemed suddenly the sort of project worth reviving. I return with the Duchess to the Bell Tower on an ordinary afternoon, curious about the practicalities as much as the symbolism. The tower is narrow and the stair tight. We climb in single file. Up here, the world drops away to fields and the sweep of the river glinting like a strip of mercury. The bell is visible through the louvered windows, bronze skin dull with weather but recently polished, straps taut and new.
The bell itself has a history that reads like a chest of linked small things. A fund from a marriage settlement in the 19th century, a late attempt to replace a cracked bell in the 1920s, a ledger entry from the 1940s noting deferred maintenance, the fire's disruption in 1975, the community-led fundraising much later that made the recent restoration possible. Bells, it turns out, are stubborn repositories of time. They are meant to be heard, and so their life is public. You can tell a lot about a place by how it rings, Tom says when he joins us, wiping his palms. He is proud and a little wistful. A bell is conversation between generations. The narrative arc tightens when Allison invites me to examine a set of photographs taken during the restoration after the fire. In the images, I see men and women of the town, young and old, elbow deep in soot and ash, holding water-pumped cloths and cradling scorched frames. One photograph is captioned with a modest line, "Community Salvage, Nove Deck, 1975." Another shows the bell rope being braided by school children who had been rostered to help the salvage team. These images, the volunteer faces, the banded rope, the careful hands, become the human center of the story. The castle had been saved not only by estate funds, but by a town's unwillingness to watch its local memory disappear. At a long wooden table in the dining room that has been used for public dinners, we gather to read aloud some of the letters. The Duke chooses a page and we listen as Allison reads the gist. The paper crackles like a small animal. The letter tells of a decision by an ancestor hastily made during a time of famine in the 1880s to redirect funds intended for a bell toward food relief for tenants. There is a tone of pragmatic generosity in the lines, a household compelled to choose between symbolic continuity and immediate mortal need. It is a narrative knot, an intention deferred, an urgent need met. The Bell Project becomes a living question of priorities across generations. It is in that communal light that the idea of reviving the bell as a commemoration of rescue emerges. Donations come from unexpected quarters, a retired blacksmith from the next village, a shipping magnate living abroad with family ties to the estate, anonymous envelopes slipped under the archivist's office door. The Adopt a Document program that Allison speaks of later offers supporters the chance to underwrite conservation for a particular item, often a letter, a map, a diary page, thus producing small, traceable acts of preservation. The program's donors are not all wealthy patrons. Many give modest sums because they want to be part of the castle's future story. It is, Allison says, the democracy of conservation. A delicate strand of the castle's narrative involves men who returned from captivity deeply changed. There are references, carefully noted and never sensationalized, to family members who came back from prisoner of war camps and struggled to fit into peacetime routines. The Duke speaks of these returns with a measured sorrow. They came back with holes that mended in strange ways, he says, choosing his words with respect. The house, recovering from the later fire and earlier wartime disruptions, had to learn to accommodate fragility. The archivist points to a set of wartime letters that show terse tenderness, short statements about the weather, a request for cigarettes, a line about fooling with the garden when he came back. We do not read diagnoses into these papers. We allow the suggestion of trauma to stand as historical fact, a presence that the estate has acknowledged and learned to live with through communal care. There is also, inevitably, discussion of money and modern pressures. The Duchess guides me through rooms that has been subtly repurposed. One upstairs flat is now a holiday let that brings income and seasonal visitors. Certain pictures were sent to a selective touring program to generate funds. These are careful decisions made in consultation with conservators and local stakeholders. We have to keep something of ourselves private, the Duchess says, but we also have to be honest about sustainability. If we do not adapt, the house may not survive at all. In the meantime, the restoration itself accommodated craft. Local carpenters replaced beams with oak grown within the region. A plasterer matched cornice work by studying 19th century patterns. The weavers in the town remade tapestry fragments using hand-spun wool. These craftspeople, Glen tells me, treated the house as they would a friend, with patience, curiosity, and sometimes with humor. There are small jokes about the caprices of 18th century joints and the uncanny way an old hinge knows better than a plan. The conservation work, while technical, reads in practice as an exercise in storytelling, and every repaired joist or re-sewn hem is a line returned to the book. I spend another morning with Allison as she walks me through the cataloging process. She shows me a ledger where papers pulled from the 1975 salvage are listed with notes, charred margins, water staining, missing signatures. She speaks of prioritization, what must be treated immediately to prevent further decay, what can sit in a low-risk box for a season. There is a moral economy in her choices. She also reveals a digital initiative. Selected documents are photographed and made available online for researchers and donors. Access matters, Allison says. We wanted to make sure that people who could not travel here could still see their history. The digital surrogate cannot replace the original, he insists, but it widens the community of care. One afternoon, an elderly woman from the town drops by the archive with a shoebox of black and white family photographs.
She is shy, but determined, pulling out faces to show us. Among the photos is an image of a group of volunteers on a muddy lawn, wearing overcoats, mud splattered, smiling with the awkward relief of people who have done hard work for the right reasons. She points to herself, a small girl then, sleeves rolled, holding a rope. We thought it would all be gone, she says, but we couldn't let it. Her voice trembles against the memory, and then steadies. In her hands, the anecdote becomes testimony. The emotional heart of the story arrives inevitably in a letter that seems to bridge personal and communal ambitions. Allison finds in an unassuming box correspondence dating to 1889 that mentions a pledge toward the casting of a bell, set aside in the past out of immediate need, then almost forgotten. There is an account book entry from 1923 noting that the bell idea had been discussed and deferred. Another note from the 1940s indicates that wartime shortages delayed anything further. The paper trail terminates in a marginal scribble that reads like an apology. Yet the letter's tone is patient, civic-minded, a proposition to bind sound to memory. I read aloud the paraphrase. An ancestor, mindful of tenants and the parish, writes of combining funds to buy a bell that would call the congregation and mark time for those who live upon these grounds. The phrasing is formal but human, and it produces an audible response from the small group gathered at the table. For me, as someone who has married into this family and who happens to carry my own private curiosity about belonging, the letter feels like a hinge, the kind of archival moment that moves an interior conversation into action. The decision to restore or create a bell now carries new weight. It would not merely be an object of sound. It would be a deliberate act of reconciliation with the past, honoring a promise deferred, commemorating the salvage, making audible the town's quiet heroism. Donations trickle in. The shop sells mold something at a winter market to underwrite the cost. School children design a small booklet about the Bell Project that is printed on modest paper. Each book paid for another pound toward casting. The financial mechanics are less dramatic than the network of small sacrifices, small monies pooled into a tangible outcome. The bell, when finally commissioned, bears an inscription that reads largely of gratitude. As the restoration progresses, the team schedules a community day. The town gathers at the forecourt while a temporary scaffold frames the bell tower. There is a feeling of festival. The Duchess organizes tea in the walled garden, and wine appears for the grown-ups. Children make buntings. Old volunteers who were there in 1975 come forward to be photographed beside the new bell and the men who did the casting. The archive stocks a small exhibit with captions, photographs, salvaged fragments, a short oral history transcript.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é um narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era Aged Fragments, a Short Oral History Transcript. Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. People trace their fingers along the rope when allowed, feeling the rough hemp of the line that will one day pull the clapper. The ceremony is simple and quiet. It contains no rhetoric about triumph. Rather, it is a communal sigh of relief, a collective mapping of continuity. The climb to the bell tower for the first time with the newly hung bell is careful work. A conservator checks the fittings. Tom talks through the safety measures. The Duchess suggests we ring it slowly, letting the sound roll rather than strike the air like an announcement. I stand near the tower window and look down across the lawn, where townspeople stand with cups steaming in the cold. When the rope falls and the bell answers, the sound is not loud in the way a trumpet is loud. It is a warm, round chord that seems to settle into the folds of the glen. People look at one another and smile, and some of them have tears that glisten in cheeks weathered by wind and life. Later, Allison shows me the accession record for the bell and explains the notation, the inscription, the date, the donors' names, the fund code. The object moves from the realm of material into the life of the archive as a documented fact. It will be cataloged, photographed, and included in a forthcoming guide. Yet its purpose remains performative. Its meaning comes alive each time someone pulls that rope. There is a private echo to all these public gestures. In a small sunlight-lit study, the Duke shows me a pocket diary of a great-grandfather, a man who went abroad and who kept a careful tally of letters sent and received. The diary includes an entry in which the writer notes his intention to honor an earlier pledge when things are steadier.
That phrasing, repeated across documents, suggests a continuity of intention interrupted by necessity. To see the bell raised now feels for some in the family like completing an unfinished sentence. We end one day on the roof where slate and sky meet. The wind is sharper up there. The view from the towers makes the estate look like a map folded in 3 dimensions. The Duchess leans against the parapet, and for a moment the house seems to inhale. Below us, the river moves on as it always has. The conversation on the roof is quieter, more intimate. There are jokes about drafty chimneys and how the servants once used to slide along the banisters with an efficiency that modern health and safety would never authorize. There are admissions, too, difficult choices made, a family history that includes both pride and private sorrow. I confessed in a small, almost embarrassed way that marrying into this world altered my sense of time. The household routines, the cataloging of letters, the way a repaired tapestry can outlast a lifetime, these habits of stewardship have taught me a certain patience. The Duke smiles at the admission and tells me something simple. To live in a place like this is to be responsible not just for a building, but for the story it tells.
His voice carries neither arrogance nor false modesty. It is an accepted fact of his role. Outside on the green, someone has set up a small table of local crafts, hand-carved spoons, jars of heather honey, postcard prints of the bell tower. A child tugs at his mother's sleeve and points up toward the tower. The mother explains, in a tone I imagine many of us use with children. This is where people went to call the village together, where they marked time and celebrated weddings and funerals. The child nods with the uncomplicated attention of someone newly introduced to a useful metaphor, bells as markers of living. There are, inevitably, quieter shadows threaded through the narrative. The house's history includes a few fraught chapters, relations strained by alcoholism in a distant generation, a son who came back from captivity and never quite found a footing, which the family recounts with restraint and a wish not to sensationalize. These matters are acknowledged in a sober tone, hard times that the family faced, sometimes privately, and which the estate endured as it did other hardships. The focus remains on recovery and the pragmatic steps taken to heal, therapy offered, community supports, the quiet work of renewed habits. The archive preserves these records as part of the wholeness of the family story rather than as exposed wounds. As the weeks of filming, as my stays elongate, I find my own storytelling aligning with the archive's pace. I come to understand that heritage is compiled from decisions both minor and major, from the way a garden is pruned to the way a ledger is rewritten. The human scenes remain central. Allison's careful labeling, Glen's patient description of rose grafting, Tom's reverence for landscape, the Duchess's balancing of privacy and publicness, and the Duke's pragmatic stewardship. Each person brings a distinct note to the place's chorus. One evening, the town hall hosts a small lecture in which the Duchess and Allison speak about restoration and the Adopt a Document program. People in the audience ask about conservation, the costs involved, and the trustworthiness of donate online programs. The Duchess answers plainly. Donations go to a restricted fund. Transparency is maintained. Small amounts can be transformative when pooled. Allison talks about the thrill of watching a fragile letter come back to legibility after treatment, the way ink returns from the brink. There is no theatrics in their speech, only clarity,
and the response from the audience is affection mingled with practical interest. It is in the slow work of cataloging and in the modest campaign to adopt documents that the castle's story becomes most democratic. People who once only passed the castle on the A road begin to feel a small proprietary delight when they see their name on a donor plaque or when they hear the bell ring and know that they helped pay for it.
De arquivo de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Você é um narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era: Bell ring and know that they helped pay for it. Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal, sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Fim das instruções. The archive's online catalog bears donor acknowledgements in a way that makes stewardship visible. The castle's future, then, is not held in the hands of a single family, but shared across a network of small acts and a town that remembers the night they saved paintings and books from the smoke. One afternoon, Allison calls me into the reading room with a quiet excitement that is both professional and personal. She has found another document, a brief note tucked within a volume of estate accounts. It is a scribbled addendum from 1890 in a clerk's hand that references the earlier pledge toward a bell and mentions, poignantly, that the sum had been set aside and then used to feed the poor during a harsh winter. The clerk's note reads with the mercantile brevity of someone accounting for both coins and conscience. To me, and to several people gathered when Allison reveals it, the note reads like a moral compass. The family had once chosen immediate mercy over symbolic continuity. The choice is neither condemnable nor laudable in simple terms. Instead, it maps character. This archival discovery becomes the hinge of our upcoming community event. The bell will be dedicated not only in memory of the salvage and the volunteers of 1975, but also as a nod to those earlier choices that kept tenants fed through winter. The dedication program is carefully composed. Readings from letters, a short music piece performed by a local choir, an acknowledgement of donors, and then the ringing itself. It is a modest, inward-facing ceremony that keeps its humility even as it embraces the public. In the last light before the dedication, I climb the tower once more. The bell sits heavy and primed. The sky is midsummer blue. The valley drinks the light. I think of the man who redirected funds to feed people in 1890 and of the school children in 1975 who braided the rope, and of the volunteers who hauled soot-blackened paintings to safety. The bell will not erase the past. It will make it audible, an invitation to remember in sound. In that way, the bell functions like the archive itself, both object and prompt. We plan a small exhibit in the entrance hall that assembles the threads. A photograph of volunteers hand-washing soot from frames, a copy of the 1890 clerk's note, a ledger page, a pamphlet on the Adopt a Document program. The text on the wall explains, in measured language, how the town and the family together chose to repair and to remember. It invites visitors to engage not as passive observers, but as participants in a living project. As I leave the castle that evening, the bells begin to ring, gently at first, then fuller. The sound is not triumphalistic. It is like someone closing a book with affection, a neat gesture that promises more reading to come. People stand on the lawn, some with hands over mouths, others smiling.
A child tugs a parent's sleeve and points at the tower as if to say, "They did it." The parent nods and squeezes the child's hand. When I later sit at my own kitchen table, pen poised over my notebook, I think about the strange ethics of telling other people's houses. There is a duty to be careful and a delight in discovery. The castle's story is not a single thread, but a weave. Charity and delay, damage and repair, archive and bell, private grief and public care. Each element matters less as an isolated event and more as part of a pattern that shows how human beings choose to save what they value. There are practical lessons here. Conservators taught me to look for the grain of original wood, to test the stitch of a seam, to consult the ledger before assuming the object's provenance. The garden shows the virtue of patience. The town demonstrates the power of civic responsibility. For visitors and would-be custodians, the moral is clear. Preservation is less a heroic rescue and more a steady network of small acts, time, money, and attention pooled to keep fragile things alive. I do not pretend to end this account neatly. There remain documents Allison has yet to transcribe, rooms the Duchess will not open this season, conservation projects on the list whose funding is not yet settled. There are questions about how to balance the house as a private home and as a place of public memory. Those tensions will continue to be negotiated. But for now, as the last bell tone lingers and the lanterns are lit along the drive, there is a palpable feeling of repair. If this story has moved you, consider becoming part of a preservation network. Visit the estate, donate a small sum to an archives fund, or adopt a document through the program Allison described. Every gesture helps to keep these fragile memories legible for the next generation. None of it is too small. I stand one last time beneath the tower and listen. The bell is a simple instrument and a complicated promise. It rings, and because it rings, people remember not only that things can be lost, but also that they can be rescued, carefully, collectively, and with an unflashy stubbornness that often feels like love. The house settles into night, the lanterns in the windows like many small invites. I gather my coat and think about the pages I have yet to read and the stories I have yet to tell. There are letters that will change the shape of family lore, photographs that will clarify the sequence of salvage, voices of townspeople who will tell me things that documents cannot fully capture. For now, the bell hangs, the archive hums with quiet industry, and the town carries its soft pride. Tomorrow, Allison has promised to show me a set of maps that may reveal an earlier route to the river, one that could explain a long-asked question about land boundaries. I want to follow that line. I want to speak more with Glen about the heirloom roses and with the Duchess about the idea of opening a new educational program for local schools. There is work and there is discovery, and the two are braided. For now, I walk down the drive in the cool night, the bells echo still in my ears, feeling that peculiar mix of wonder and responsibility that living places inspire. I will be back into the archive, into the gardens, into conversations with the people whose hands keep this house alive. There are more documents to be conserved, more stories to be shared, and perhaps another small public project that will bind the community to the castle's future. Allison meets me in the archive before the light has fully climbed the hill. She has a thermos and a careful smile, and the maps are already laid out on the long table under the green-shaded lamp. The paper is thin, the ink foxed to brown, and the folds are soft from being opened and refolded 100 times. Outside the tall shuttered windows, a dog barks twice, and then is still.
Inside, the steady hush of the room makes conversation move in whispers. This set, Allison says, tapping a margin where a small hand has written a note in a pencil older than either of us, was part of Lord Pembroke's estate pack. He had the habit of keeping multiple surveyors, one to confirm the other. Look here. She turns the map so that the river cuts across it like a pale ribbon. A faded dotted line traces a path between fields and hedgerows. Alongside it, faintly, are the letters ROW, right of way. At first, I see only irregular parcels, names of tenants, the geometric impatience of lines meant to fix land into accounts and obligations. But Allison points and I follow with my finger until the dotted route reappears as a scatter of ink dashes that move away from the riverbank and, impossibly, through a place where the present lane is nowhere to be found. They rerouted it, she says, after a flood perhaps, or to suit a new tenant. But this older line, if it's the same as the note in the ledger, could explain the boundary claims that were made in 1842. It would mean the meadow past Willow Glen was always within the house's commons. We speak in small, precise sentences, not because the map demands respect, but because the map rewards careful listening. To trace an old road is to move across other people's decisions. Drainage, hedgerow planting, who paid for a stone bridge. And each choice ripples forward in titles and fences and the stubborn growth of elder trees. Allison produces a magnifying lens, and we lean over the cartography like medics leaning over a body. The lines give up little, but what they give is decisive. There is indeed an earlier route, and tucked beneath a compass rose is a notation in a clerk's hand. Mill rights reserved by order of 1768. The words are modest, bureaucratic, but what they mean is substantial. There was once an economic tie to the river that explains why, 3 generations later, a dispute flared over access to the floodplain. We take a carriage, partly so Allison can talk, and partly so I can see the landscape rework itself into the shapes on the paper.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é um narrador, palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era Cape rework itself into the shapes on the paper. Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. The lane that exists now curves where the map goes straight. Hedges have crept, and a modern culvert blunts the old bank. Glen meets us at the footbridge, sleeves rolled and fingers smelling of earth. He has been feeling the roses and looks as if he has been waiting for this exact day. You'll see it best by the sycamore, he says, leading us along a path so narrow the grass holds us close. The river is low and bright, stones show like teeth. Where the map's dotted line would have met a ford, there is now an overgrown ramp of clay and flint, a seam in the riverbank where roots have refused to yield. A stone, half buried and polished by water, bears a mason's mark. Allison was right, Glen says, and there is a softness to the way he pronounces the name right. He thinks of maps as companions, of lanes as relatives. He remembers hearing his grandfather's voice say that rights of way were stubborn things, handed down and litigated like surnames. He runs his palm over the moss and says, "They diverted it because the millmaster wanted his wheel to get more head. They hardened the bank and the pommel with stone. It was cheaper than paying the village for the work." The archaeology of the place unspools in conversations like that. Small economies, private ambitions draped over communal resource. A decision that shaped who walked which road to church for 100 years after. As we walk back across the meadow, the sun coming up behind a low bank of cloud,
I think of the ledger entries, the stitch of human intention that turns a landscape into a story. Back at the castle, the Duchess waits in the morning room with the day's post and a tray by the window. She is brisk with the kinds of practicalities that had, at first, made her seem aloof. There are calls with the conservator, a scheduled visit from the local school head, and a donor who wants to see the textile samples. Yet there is also a look in her that I have come to understand as possibility, the private woman who, when the house is quiet, lets plans for the community be sketched in pencil across her lap. I thought about your idea for the summer, she tells me, handing over a thin packet of correspondence. The packet contains letters I have not yet seen, nearby heirlooms of paper with names that curve like signatures across the page. She watches me with a small patience. If we can show children what it means to keep a place, they might learn to care for the town in ways money cannot buy. We lay out the letters on the table under archival tissue. The handwriting shifts between tight clerk scripts and a looser, more intimate hand. One envelope bears 3 thin dried petals, long since browned. The first letter, dated 1839, is from a woman named Eleanor to her cousin in town, describing a harvest and a man who repaired a wheel.
Plans form like delicate scaffolding, a volunteer rota, a pilot summer series, materials lists. The head teacher proposes a class project. Students interview their grandparents and bring one story or object to the house's oral history table. The potter offers to lead a mending session where broken crockery is joined with visible seams and lacquer, showing the value of keeping over replacing. Glen volunteers to show children how to propagate a rose cutting by his stove, a practical ritual of continuity. The Duchess agrees to open a wing for the pilot week, not the whole house, as a way to measure impact and learn. Funding remains the stubborn edge. The donor who had promised a lead gift wants to see measurable outcomes. Another potential benefactor stipulates a plaque in the garden. We shape a modest case, a stewardship fund for educational programs that will prioritize local school access, conservation handling, and a small stipend for volunteers. Allison suggests the adopt a document idea she had mentioned the night of the bell. Donors can underwrite the conservation of a letter or map and, in return, receive updates and allow a child to read the conserved item in a supervised session. It is, as she says, a way to make giving personal and pedagogical at once. In the margins of the proposals are ethical questions I keep coming back to. When a donor suggests that a certain portrait should be exhibited as the face of the estate to encourage tourism, I find myself wondering who gets to be representative of a complicated history. When a local councillor suggests commercial events, concerts, weddings, I think of the nights when the house is a private place for grief and laughter, not inventory for profit. These are not arguments of principle, but of scale. How do you balance the house as home with the house as public good? The answers are messy and necessarily negotiated. The pilot week arrives like a sweetenously nervous tide. Children come on a bus, cheeks pink and voices bright. They are smaller than the rooms, but large in curiosity. They settle into rota stations, one table for handling replica buttons, another for planting cuttings. The head teacher reads aloud from Eleanor's letter, while the children crowd in, hands on their knees, their faces open. A child asks what a mill is. Another wants to know why the soldier left a trunk. Glen shows them how to strip a cane and make a simple graft. A young girl with a world of questions in her eyes asks if she can plant the graft in her backyard. The potter makes visible mends on a cracked jug and calls it celebration stitching. The room hums with the kind of noise that means learning is taking root. Questions layered over each other, laughter, small determinations.
On the last day, the children march down to the sycamore with a hand-stitched banner declaring themselves guardians of the lane.
They hand it to the Duchess, who pins it to the notice board with a look of something like gratitude and awe. She walks the children to the river and tells them, simply, how the house and the town have shared the river for centuries. No grand speech, rather the modest, sober recounting of an interdependency that makes the place what it is. The children, who had come seeking treasure and craft, leave with maps photocopied and a list of things they can do to keep places alive. Notice a broken bench, pick up litter, tell the story of a grandparent. Not everything is smoothed by the pilot. There are tears, real and small, around the handling table when a replica that was meant to look like a child's cap is more frayed than some of the originals, and a student finds that a replica does not have the same ghost of a life the original does. The conservators note afterward that the textiles need a longer, gentler treatment than we expected. A donor postpones a promised gift when his priorities shift. But there is also momentum. A local gardening group asks for permission to revive a neglected border, and an elderly woman brings forward a small trunk of letters she had kept in a cedar chest all her life, wanting them to be read aloud. One of those trunks, when it arrives, contains a note that tilts what we thought we knew. It is an apology of sorts, written by a housekeeper who had worked in the nursery in 1907. She admits, in careful sentences, that she had once burned a stack of receipts that named a woman as the mother of an illegitimate child of a lord. The receipts were minor, purchases of fabric, of milk, but their absence had allowed gossip to wither into silence, and later to harden into a respectable family story that erased a woman's claim. The note is an ethical detonator, not an accusation so much as an explanation of structural forgetting. When houses are repositories of power, they can also be instruments of erasure. We read the note in the morning room and feel the temperature shift. The Duchess listens with her hands folded. When I ask if she knew of such erasures, she shakes her head in a way that is both honest and relieved. The house has been curated by a particular kind of memory, she says. We are only now learning how to ask what has been left out. And so new work begins, not the physical conservation of objects only, but the recovery of minor presences. We make a plan to reach out to the descendants of nursery staff, to put a call in the local paper asking for family stories, to offer digitization services for people who want to share photographs but fear their fragility. The archivists set aside days for oral history training. Glen, who once said he had no taste for paperwork, volunteers to catalog memories on a weekend because he wants to know more about the hands that have worked the estate grounds. At dusk, after a long day of interviews and the mechanical kindness of cataloging, I walk alone through the walled garden.